Tools and Means. Written and read by John Miro. Episode 8. Pain. Claire's world was pain. She opened her eyes and the world spun crazily. Vomit filled her throat. She collapsed to the floor. She heard voices, 2 men. She couldn't understand the words. She craned her neck, tried to make out the 2 blurry forms before she had to close her eyes and struggle against waves of nausea and blackness. She lay there and took shallow breaths. What was happening? She didn't know what was happening. The last thing she remembered was Senator Newell smiling as he smashed the coffee carafe into the side of her head. Grunts, breaking furniture, bodies falling drew her back to the present. She caught scraps of words. Diseased. Broken. Don't touch her. Then struggling sounds across the room, and someone else kneeling over her again. Panic gripped her as the scent of Newell's sickly sweet sweat filled her nostrils. Then she heard him truckle. Claire lay helpless on the floor as Newell came closer. Please, no. Tom writhed helplessly on the wall as George, now Bob, knelt over the unconscious woman on the floor. His mouth twisted, deformed with his terror as he tried to scream and fought harder. George Bob looked back. He seemed to lean towards Tom then, like a man fighting through fierce wind. With a gasp, he fell hard to one knee. He stared at Tom with a combination of anger and disbelief. Tom fought harder still. One of his hands moved a few inches along the wall. Strain showed on George's face. He leaned even further towards Tom. A vein stood out on his forehead. He pressed his empty hand to his chest and clutched the other, the one holding the glowing blue ball, into a fist, raising it away from Claire. Tom spat and he snarled, pushed with all he had against the invisible force trapping him on the wall. George, now Bob, swayed. His eyes lost focus. The muscles of his face went slack. His filthy sweat dropped from his nose down onto his sister, Allie. Oh, not Allie. But he held the blue orb just inches above her now. He turned all the way around, lowered the cupped hand to rest on her forehead, and then snapped a victorious stare back at Tom. But just then, the eyes and lips grew wide, went slack, and George fell away from Allie, dropping the glowing sphere and writhing on the ground. The pressure against Tom disappeared. He exploded off the wall, tumbling in a heap at the foot of the bed. He scrambled onto his hands and feet and leaped across his sister, watching as Bob, no, it was George again, struggled to get up to one knee. His eyes were bulging, his face blood red. He stared hard, and Tom felt the eerie, stroking pressure building against his skin again. No! Tom smashed into George, and the 2 of them toppled over together. They fell to the floor, and Tom buried the blade of his jackknife in the senator's neck. He thrust harder, buried the entire blade, and twisted. He heard the arterial spray slap against the wall before George fell to the ground like a puppet with his strings cut. And he laid there, gasping for air, pushing the forearm of his knife hand against George's shoulder to pin him down. He watched hot blood gush out from between wattles of neck fat. George's last wet breath rattled loose. Tom watched the man's chest. It didn't move. The spurt of blood from the far side of George's neck slowed, then stopped. Tom waited and watched. Finally satisfied, Tom nodded. A little more balance in the world, he thought with pride, before his body shook hard once, and all feeling went away. Paralyzed, his body dropped like cordwood. His head bounced off the red, slicked floor. The blue glow in the room doubled, and the ball George had been holding over the woman rose into the air to float before Tom's face. He stared, fascinated, horrified, as the solid exterior of the sphere dissolved into a cloud of light. The cloud circled his head, streaming and billowing like an aurora. Then the light poured into him. Tom let out a gurgle very much like poor dead George's. His body jerked as if he'd been prodded with a live wire. His twitching eyes weren't following his signals anymore, but he was looking at Allie again. Except it wasn't Allie anymore. It never had been. He knew that now. She was awake. Claire was awake. She watched him, eyes wide, as the blue glow disappearing inside him threw shifting shadows over her face before it disappeared completely. Tom was only along for the ride as his body recovered the bloody jackknife, rose, and walked towards the girl. Behind her, Bob was back, leaning over the corner of the bed. He tittered, a rat-like sound, the laugh the killer had made when he'd tortured his father and mother in the chairs they would die in days later. No. Bob licked his lips and looked at Tom with disturbing vigor. Well, ain't you in a pickle, hoss? George Newell's body jerked again and again. Wet gagging sounds came out of him, and then his fat body relaxed to the ground and was still. Claire watched the killing. She watched the life drain out of Newell, and her breathing eased as his stopped. She watched the man straddling Newell's corpse. The hate on his face changed, became a complex mixture of satisfaction and pain. He had saved her. This man had saved her life. The paralysis squeezing her lungs began to ease. She could breathe a little deeper now. Her stomach raged a little less. She lay there watching the man's eyes fill with tears. She wanted to say something. But what? Thank you? She drew in a shuddering breath and struggled to find the right words. She never found them. The blue light on the floor caught her eye and derailed her thoughts. The blue light that began to pulse. Animalistic fear clutched her again. She struggled onto her side and fought with leaden arms to push herself away from the small blue sphere. She looked up at the man, trying to find new words now, trying to warn him. He was looking down at Newell, nodding softly. She thought he looked like a mourner standing over the grave of a loved one. She tried again to find her words when the sphere began to rise into the air. Tom's world spun. His thoughts turned red and chaotic. Panic owned him like an animal, telling him he was drowning, not in water, but in something else. Something alive. He had to get away. He jerked up into the air and stumbled backwards. His body burned. His hands shook. His back was slick with sweat as he strained against something that was settling inside his skin. Was he possessed? He whimpered, or he meant to, but no sound left his throat. His eyes roved in his head, but not to the places he meant to send them, then settled back on the girl again. "Thank you," she cried softly, and held her hands in front of herself. He was horrified. No one had ever seen him do his work before. He needed to turn and walk, slowly and calmly, out the door, and disappear. Instead, he knelt, crawled to the woman's side, batted her offered hand away, and pushed her down to the floor face first, twisting an arm behind her back. "You killed a powerful man," he heard his voice say. He heard scorn there. No, that's not right. He felt it. And dark pleasure as his fingers brushed her neck. Neither emotion was his. She struggled weakly, cried out just a little, and trembled. Tom felt nothing. Even his rage was distant, unreal. He watched the world move around him and felt powerless and small, the way he used to, in the house with Bob. This isn't you," Claire Romer said. It wasn't a question, but her voice was confused. "That's fine, so was he." "He rejected your advances," the voice continued. His voice. "And you succumbed to a jealous rage." His body held her down, put a knee in her back even as her face twisted back up, working with the effort to understand his words. After the battering she'd withstood, Tom was impressed with her willpower to still be conscious, still be striving to catch up to the whirlwind that tossed them both. Her eyes widened. She couldn't understand the change, but he could see that she understood the danger. She got one hand free and began to pound on his thigh. Whatever controlled his body ignored her blows, grabbed the arm, and bent it behind her too. "She's so strong," thoughts stroking the inside of his head. Cold and emotionless thoughts. "A pity we couldn't take her." His hands flattened against the back of her head and slammed it down against the floor. Her struggling stopped. Tom's rage burned hotter as he watched himself spin her over, put the jackknife in her hand, and hold it against her other wrist. "When you saw what you did, you took your own life." The blade pressed against her wrist, but did not cut. "No." The hand began to tremble. A single drop of blood appeared on Claire's wrist. "No." Tom shook his head, and it moved, jerkily, but it was his again to move as he commanded. He felt the fire burn brighter in his gut, and movement became easier. He pulled the blade away from the woman's wrist and stood. She curled in a ball, weeping. She stole a fearful glance at him and then looked quickly away. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide. She'd fought so hard, but now she just lay there, paralyzed by her fear, the same way he was paralyzed by... "What is this?" asked the hijacker inside his head. "I am the rider." The words came with spasms of pain ripping through Tom's body. The scream was not one of rage, but of something focusing its will now, focusing on breaking Tom's fragile, regained control. "No," he slurred aloud, falling backwards away from the woman who got to her knees as he retreated, sensing her chance to save her life. Again, he was struck by her strength. Still, she trembled there on hands and knees, terrified to move, Tom thought, terrified she might draw him back. He wanted to shout at her to stand up, turn around, and run, but despite her willpower, he could see she was still stunned. He watched her fall to the ground and curl back into a ball. That's when Tom noticed the drop of blood dripping down her forehead. Maybe a concussion had her now. George had hurt her. And then he had hurt her. No, the rider in his head had hurt her. The rider in his head wanted her dead. A single alien thought rippled through his mind. It resists. He ignored the voice and staggered forward. Claire wailed and hid her head in her arms. "Forget, forget," he wheezed to the lady doctor, pushing the words out before the alien fingers probing his mind could pull them back. "Please, forget I was here." He stepped around her toward the door, Halfway across the room, all the muscles in his back spasmed at once. He roared in pain. He knew it was the rider, whatever that was, fighting him for control, but he kept his feet under him and staggered out the ruined door. As he left, he saw Claire's head raised to watch him go in the mirror beside the door, and he stumbled through faster, fleeing from her wide eyes. He shambled towards the door to the stairwell. It felt like he was wading through cement. His body resisted every order he gave it until he flayed it with his will. I am the rider. Both Tom's knees exploded in pain. Felt like glass shards stabbing into tendons, slicing through to bone. Tom howled, but he stayed on his feet. He looked down, grabbed his left knee with both hands. His head swam and he almost fell, but his fingers told the tale. No blood, no cuts, no wounds at all. He laughed, high-pitched and manic, but he laughed. Ryder? Tom spat at the puppet master, tugging at his body from within. No, you're nothing. Tom tugged open the steel fire door and staggered out into the stairwell. You have been listening to Tools and Means. Title music, Infiltrate This, by Atlas Plug. Use with permission. For show notes, more information, and other fiction by me, John Miro, please visit servingworlds.com. Thank you for listening.